What's happening? Danitz couldn't believe what he was seeing. This didn't shock him, but it left him inexplicably terrified. It was like jumping into a bucket filled with ice when drunk, feeling a bone-piercing chill permeate his body from the soles of his feet to his head. What exactly happened? Why did things become so strange? Danitz took a breath, forcing himself to turn his head, and he chased after Jamin Sparrow. He found the crazy adventurer walking faster and faster, to the point where he had to run with small paces to keep up. Crossing the street and through the alley, Danitz suddenly saw a greenish shadow fall from a tree. Puh! Its body was covered in scales as it twisted its slippery body and had a triangular head. It extended its scarlet forked tongue and was none other than a rather long, venomous snake. Dogshit! Why would there be snakes in this season? Danitz wasn't afraid of such creature. He had even roasted snake meat before, but it was the abnormality of everything that left him agitated. Circling around the coiling snake, Danitz subconsciously looked left and right and found that on both sides of the gutter, in the corners of ruined houses, and on the insides of rusty water pipes, there were pairs of cold, vertical, and different-colored eyes looking out. Danitz felt a chill run down his spine, as if his scalp had been pierced by a dense array of fine needles. He didn't dare to stay any longer, nor did he dare to leave. He increased his speed again and followed closely behind Jamin Sparrow. Entering the Wind of Azure Inn, he couldn't help but look up as he walked up the wooden stairs, wanting to ask something. Suddenly, his chest tightened and his breathing stagnated. At that moment, it was as if he had dived into the bottom of the sea, being pressed down by the heavy torrents of water from every direction. Whoosh! Faintly, Danitz heard the rush of the tide and saw a faint, illusory light surround Jamin Sparrow, as if it were forming an endless, bottomless blue ocean. Within that ocean, there was an enormous azure-blue figure holding everything up. It resembled a tower. Danitz's right foot stopped in midair, unable to lower his foot. He wasn't unfamiliar with such feeling. Back at the last pirate convention, the King of the Five Seas, Nast, was even more imposing and terrifying than this. Almost all the pirates couldn't lift their heads, and even powerhouses at the admiral rank could only barely resist. Danitz knew very well that it wasn't a result of Jamin Sparrow's own power. If he was at the level of a demigod, there was no need to include the mandated punishers during his hunt of Steel Mavetti. Ocean tide, these two terms flashed through Danitz's mind, and he immediately thought of the matter of the Resistance's faith in sea god Calvatur. See, could it be that Jamin Sparrow suffered the sea god's curse via an unknown process when he touched the bone sword? The devotee's corpse that lost all its moisture is one of the conditions for the curse's activation. When the carriage driver prostrated and kissed the ground, was it because he sensed the sea god's aura? Man, Jamin Sparrow would probably die here today. Should I stay far away to avoid being implicated? At the very most, I'll come back to collect his corpse. It might still be possible to save him. I can use the soulfall ritual to seek Captain's help. She knows so many different kinds of odd secret technique. She should be able to resolve this problem. No, Lord. The soulfall ritual has a requirement of being within 500 nautical miles. They're still en route, and it will take at least half a day to enter that range. As he desperately tried to think of something, Danitz stopped panicking and treaded steadily into the luxurious suite with Jamin Sparrow. Klein still remained silent, but his dark brown eyes seemed to have a rich azure-blue color that was nearing the color of black. He went straight to the bedroom and locked the door behind him. Danitz stood outside, in a dilemma on whether to flee or save the man. Inside the bedroom, Klein closed his eyes, waiting for the right opportunity. Suddenly, he took 4 steps in a counterclockwise manner, chanting a statement with each step. A wave of manic or high-pitched ravings rapidly rang in his ears as his spirit body shot up into the gray fog. Without a sound, he heard an indescribable shrill and painful howl. Klein appeared within the ancient palace, at the very end of the long, mottled table. In the motionless gray fog below, an illusory, gigantic azure-blue sea serpent appeared. It was located in an ancient dark ruin, coiled around a half-collapsed pillar. Its hideous head was raised, and its bloody mouth was wide open, revealing many curved fangs that were even longer than a human's forearm. On its milky white fangs, there were layers upon layers of flowing blood and mucus. This sea serpent madly swung its tail, setting off terrifying waves and ridiculous ripples, causing the entire ruins to sway as if it was about to collapse. The scene rapidly shattered and dimmed. Regardless of how the unimaginably large sea serpent struggled, it was unable to turn the situation around. All it could do was let out a long, painful scream in agony as it was reduced to points of light before disappearing into the gray fog. Klein sat in the high-back chair belonging to the fool as he quietly watched everything. He didn't make any superfluous actions for a long time. The gray fog silently spread out, and the scene seemed to return to its eternally unchanging state. After nearly a minute, Klein leaned back in his chair, sighed, and said the serpent's name, "See God Calvatua." After coming into contact with the bone sword, he had already felt the abnormality. And during his conversation with Baldy Callat, he had keenly discovered that a tiny, weak but extremely cold and sinister energy had invaded his body at some point in time and was slowly corrupting his soul. Klein made a prompt decision and turned around to leave. He then sensed that there was a connection between the sinister power and his surroundings. It gradually strengthened and slowly connected to an unknown place. So, as he diverted attention to resist the corruption, he also controlled himself so as to not interact with his surroundings. Klein believed that as long as he responded to the abnormality on his journey back, it would only serve to intensify the corruption, to the point of making irreversible. At first, he wanted to find a nearby washroom and use the gray fog's shielding and isolation to remove the cold and sinister power, but after repeated considerations, he decided to leave the area. This was because there were many followers of the sea god around, and it was extremely likely for an accident to happen. During this process, Klein grasped another point, which was that if he dispelled it ahead of time, the power projected by sea god Calvatua would leave remnants in his flesh and blood. The consequences and effects would be unknown. He had no choice but to patiently wait for the opportunity to purify himself by waiting for the cold and sinister energy to thoroughly permeate his spirit. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Klein lightly rapped the edge of the table and muttered to himself, "It's not that strong." The sea god's level was much lower than he had imagined. His original plan was to use the method that had finished off Ammon's avatar to deal with the sea god Calvatua's projection, which was trying to take over his body. However, even before he had even fused with the Dark Emperor card or through his paper angel, Calvatua ended up being dispelled by the gray fog directly, without leaving a single trace. On this basis, Klein concluded that sea god Calvatua's level was inferior to blasphemer Ammon, even though it was possible that the latter was more adept at intrusion, but it had only been an avatar. Was it thrown off its pedestal by the Lord of Storms, or is it not even at the level of an angel? It's just a slightly stronger demigod that can respond to the prayers of its believers within a certain range. Klein recalled and found that sea god Calvatua was in an abnormal state. The foundational existence of this evil spirit is rather weak, as though it can collapse at any moment. Moreover, it felt like it had fused with the spirit world in the ruins it was in. And it's precisely as a result of this that it was able to escape the encirclement of the Church of Storm. Klein leaned back in his chair and made a guess. What happened today is definitely not a coincidence. It stems from archaeologist Letitia's act of taking away some important artifact in the Forgotten Temple. It caused sea god Calvatua's condition to instantly deteriorate when it was already barely surviving. It made it impossible for it to hold on to its existence. As it got its believers to track the item, it also prepared to possess another body for its survival. That bone sword should have originated from its demigod body, and it hides a bit of the power it projects. As long as the target is suitable, it will infiltrate the body of the person who touches it, corrupting the soul and establishing the coordinates. It will then allow its spirit to be transferred over before it dissipates, but clearly, it's not adept in such matter. Yes, it's not the snake of Mercury. It's unable to create a closed loop on itself for reincarnation. It's also not like blasphemer Ammon, who can be a parasite inside a person's soul. Really possess my body, it will directly cause its body to crumble and create a terrifying monster. According to this logical development, the dying Calvatua will likely engage in many crazy actions in the near future. Klein frowned. He didn't hesitate as he plummeted into the fog and returned to the real world. He unlocked the door, opened it, and entered the living room, startling the pacing Danitz. Danitz looked him up and down a few times and asked cautiously and warily, "Are you all right?" Klein maintained J.M. and Sparrow's persona and calmly replied, "TT's settled." Settled? Danitz looked around before glancing at the bedroom, wondering if he had been hallucinating, that there wasn't any sea god curse. What did he do in the bedroom? He was lifted from the curse of the sea god in just a minute or two. Man, this guy has a huge secret. Danitz took 2 steps back and made way. Beside a table covered with a significant number of miscellaneous items, the wheelchair-bound baldy Callet wore a look of regret as he said to the tattooed man, "What a pity. Just a little more, he didn't pick it up, just touched it." Edmonton sighed as well. Callet looked at the slightly bent bone sword and fervently said to himself, "When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again." Edmonton fell to his knees as well, as though confessing to a deity. As time passed, both Callet and Edmonton suddenly heard two miserable shrieks. They looked up and saw that two of their companions had collapsed. Their skin was like a weathered rock, having lost all the moisture in their body. Callet and Edmonton glanced at each other and felt a peculiar atmosphere. Both of them stood up at the same time and looked at the table. That milky-white holy sword cracked loudly, splintering into countless small pieces. Operations. When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again. But what happens if the holy sword shatters? These two sentences echoed in the minds of Callet and Edmonton. The matter was completely in the gaps of their knowledge. For a few seconds they stared at the shattered holy sword, their expressions dull while they remained speechless. They couldn't believe that the holy sword, which had only been touched by an outsider in the evening, had suddenly shattered. What does this mean? What does it represent? The two of them didn't dare to think too deeply about it. They felt as if they had returned to the very beginning. Back then, one of the secret bases of the resistance had been discovered by the lone military. They were raided without any warning, and this resulted in their fathers being killed in that massacre. Their female relatives were abducted and sold to different places. Before receiving the grievous news, the feelings Callet and Edmonton felt that day mirrored what they felt today. They felt heavy, confused, expectant, and unease, all of them mixing to form an intense pressure. Return to the forest, find the high priest, and figure out the reason. Perhaps this is the latest revelation from God. Callet turned his wheelchair and said in a deep voice. Edmonton immediately stood up, saying to his remaining subordinates, "Continue searching for those blasphemers, but do not stay here. Also, instruct the believers outside not to hold any rituals or even pray." The unexpected change in events made him extra vigilant. Bam! In the corner of the street, where the Cathedral of Waves was located. Holding a stack of white folded paper, Danitz turned his head to the side, feeling a mix of nervousness, worry, and puzzlement. "You mean that I'm to post them in different parts of the street, and finally post it on the main door of the Cathedral of Waves?" He was very afraid that the door of the cathedral would suddenly open, and a group of fist-brandishing priests and bishops would rush out, immediately attacking them without even asking why he had posted the poster. Klein maintained his coldness and said, "Yes." His original plan was to hand the matter of See God Calvatua over to Mr. Hanged Man so that he could warn the Church of Storm. However, considering that he still held the secret of Banzi Harbor, and he might even have reported the matter, it would be easy for him to arouse suspicion with another piece of important information in such a short period of time. As for the solution, it was very simple. He could post a few posters on the mandated Punisher's front door so that they could see it as soon as they came out. There was a small problem with Klein's plan. He couldn't tell which of the shops around the Cathedral of Waves was the cover identity of the mandated Punisher. All he could do was make Danitz work a little harder and stick the posters everywhere in prominent spots, including, but not limited to, the front door of the Cathedral of Waves. Should have run away earlier. Why would I think that this fellow had saved my life? Perhaps I would have been converted into gold pounds if he were any other powerful adventurer. No. Who would have imagined that this lunatic would so easily resolve the sea god's curse? Fleeing might put me in an even worse state. While lamenting inwardly, Danitz unrolled the pile of white paper and casually glanced at the content. After Letitia Dolra and company entered and left the sea god's ruin in Simim Island, they were pursued by the resistance. Meanwhile, Callet and the resistance were trying to sell a strange bone sword that looked a little bent. Sea god Calvatua's body is on the brink of collapse with an extremely deranged mental state. T4. Danitz froze for 2 seconds, then he subconsciously glanced at Jam and Sparrow. I can understand the first few statements, but why is there a mention of sea god Calvatua being on the brink of collapse and in an extremely deranged mental state? How does Jam and Sparrow know? Did he discover a problem when he was dealing with the sea god's curse? And how did he deal with the sea god's curse? The organization behind him is more powerful than I thought. Could it be that it's similar to the Aurora Order, in which they serve a real deity? The more he thought about it, the more Danitz trembled in fear. The first time he heard of the Aurora Order had originated from a robbery at sea. Back then, it was the first time he saw his captain's serious expression. After that, he was taught some so-called general knowledge of the mysterious world. Klein responded to Danitz with an emotionless gaze. In the poster, he had eliminated any subjective assumptions, and he had only described the matters that could be confirmed with certainty, so as to not interfere with the judgment of the higher-ups in the Church of Storm. Among them, the content regarding an important item that Letitia and company had taken away was excluded. The lost temple was changed to a broader and more inclusive sea god ruin. The base was obviously abandoned by Khaled and the others after realizing that something had happened to the sea god, so it was also left unmentioned. Danitz suddenly retracted his gaze, afraid to look any further. Captain said that the more secrets someone has, the more dangerous they are. He thought for a while and worriedly said, "If we stick it on the front door of the cathedral, it will definitely garner immense attention from the Church of Storm. Will they discover that I was the one who did it?" Klein gave a terse answer. "Ves." Danitz forced a smile and said, "Then wouldn't I be in grave danger?" Klein used his clown ability to control his expression and calmly replied, "You are already a pirate who has a bounty for your head. You think you can swagger down the main streets of Bayham now?" Klein lampooned inwardly. "That's true. No matter what, they will still capture me and claim my bounty. No, there's something wrong with that." Danitz blurted out, "But my bounty will increase." Klein looked at him, but he didn't say anything. All he did was grin a little. For a moment, Danitz thought he heard a rhetorical question. "Isn't this a good thing? A good thing for a donkey to kick?" With a dry chuckle, Danitz took the pile of posters, and taking advantage of the heavy winds and late night, posted them in a prominent spot on the street near the Cathedral of Waves. "It really looks like posting a small advertisement," Klein, who had one hand in his pocket, observed from afar and commented inwardly. He sighed and thought, "It's good to have an assistant. At least I don't have to do something that tarnishes my reputation. If I were in Tingen or Backland, if something like that had happened, the scene was too beautiful to imagine." Danitz finally reached outside the Cathedral of Waves, plastered the poster on the front door, clenched his fist, and pounded on the door. After finishing all of this, he turned around and ran, as if there were 10 mandated punishers running after him from behind. Klein didn't dare to be negligent. He pulled out a paper figurine, shook it off, and burned it to ashes before briskly walking to another street. After his recent encounters with the mandated punishers, he had a deep understanding of their style, and he didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless. It was only when they were far away from the Cathedral of Waves that they slowed down and regained their normal walking speed. Danitz had a good constitution. His face wasn't flushed nor was he panting. He was slightly puzzled and asked, "Why didn't you just write to the police or throw it in the Governor General's office?" Before Klein could reply, he had already realized why. "That's right. The lower-ranking police and the staff of the Governor General's office are local. They might very well pity the resistance or might be clandestine believers of Sea God." As they were talking, they turned a corner and saw an extremely large red building in front of them. The inside was brightly lit, and music could be heard from within. People in carriages streamed in and out the door. It didn't exude any vibes that it was late at night. We actually ended up walking here." After a second of hesitation, a smile appeared on Danitz's face, a smile that all men understood. "Red Theater." Klein, who was rich in theoretical knowledge, suddenly came to a realization. Danitz laughed mischievously. "This is one of the most famous places in the entire Sanya Sea. There are mysterious and flirtatious Balam girls, passionate Fainapotter girls, open and alluring Intis maidens, tall and graceful Fasek ladies, conservative and quiet lone women, gentle and docile natives. This fellow knows a lot, he comes often." Klein swept a glance at Blazing and said nothing. For some reason, Danitz felt as though he had been seen through, and he immediately laughed awkwardly. "This is what pirates talk about when bragging. I've only been here a few times. T didn't have much money in the past. I could only find some average ones, and it's mainly in the area of the Fog Sea. Afterward I joined the Golden Dream. No wonder, although Vice Admiral Iceberg's men receive quite good employment perks and often get a share in the treasure, it's still quite difficult to save up a few houses in Bayham, compared to the typical pirate. This guy at least knows temperance and saves his money," Klein thought in enlightenment. Danitz didn't wish to continue on the topic, as he changed the topic. "There are a lot of street girls in Bayham, especially there. He pointed into the distance and said, "There was once a pirate who did an experiment. He randomly knocked on a family's door, produced some money, and requested to do it with the mistress once. In the end, 3 to 4 families out of the 10 agreed. Tesk, if it's someone like you, who has the standard lone look, almost no one will refuse you. They might secretly hide their daughters to prevent you from discovering them. Heh, Lone's navy would commit many murders and rapes here every year. They aren't any better than the pirates, but they would only be sent back to the country and pay some small fine." Klein listened quietly, and he suddenly thought back to the evening when the believers of the sea god were praying around the pool. He thought back to their feverish and numb faces. Backland, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had taken the initiative to expose certain problems about himself, nervously followed Cosme underground. He once again arrived in the gray stone hall, where the black iron coffin was kept. "Esteemed Lord Nibs, why have you summoned me?" Although Emlyn had rehearsed this scene in his mind dozens of times, he still couldn't completely remove the tension and apprehension in his heart. In this state, he suddenly understood a problem. From the viewpoint of theater studies, the role he was acting as should hide his worries and fear. "There's no need for any special concealment. I did well." Emlyn was suddenly much calmer. A deep, aged voice sounded from the coffin that was covered with symbols and magic labels. "To reward you. For the ancestor, you risked your life to pray to the fool. Although you didn't receive a response, you bore an enormous risk. This is an act that needs to be rewarded. Here is an acceptance draft for £7,000, a reward for you. I didn't give it to you in a timely fashion due to the great smog of Backland, but it's never too late. At the same time, you must always be aware of yourself and not relax. If anything abnormal happens, immediately inform Cosmic." He really gave me money. Emlyn almost forgot to close his mouth. Even when Emlyn White left the Odora family's underground region, he still found things surreal. He couldn't believe that he could so easily be rewarded with £7,000. The acceptance draft was light and weightless in his hand, but he felt the absurdity of reality. The hanged man's method was really effective. Instead of exposing me and punishing me, Lord Nibs gave me a generous reward. And this was done solely to feign ignorance while encouraging me to make attempts so that he can observe in secret. Are the thoughts of the sanguine that complicated as well? Emlyn sighed, his mind feeling adrift. Quickly, he stopped his thoughts from wandering and turned his attention back to the reward of £7,000. "With this I can buy that baron's remains from the hanged man and concoct it into a potion. I'll soon become a baron, sanguine baron, Lord Emlyn White." Emlyn's eyes lit up as his footsteps turned significantly brisk. Within the sanguine, if one wasn't bestowed the corresponding ritual by the elders, they would remain stuck at the same level they were at during birth. It was almost impossible to rely on time to advance. Unless one was extremely lucky, having an ancestor of the family that was nearing the end of their lifespan, such that they had no choice but to bestow their powers to a descendant through a ritual, most of Emlyn's sanguine peers would remain stuck in the concept of adulthood. There might not be any chance of them obtaining an aristocratic title for decades. Emlyn's father and mother had lived for years, but they had yet to become barons up this very day. They couldn't even see any hope of becoming one. As Emlyn walked out the door, he couldn't help but glance at the nearby Cosme Odora. This elderly sanguine who has been active in the Roselle era has only been a baron up to this day, and I am about to reach this rank as well. One day, I will become a sanguine marquis like Lord Nibs. No, a duke or even a prince. Only by doing so will I be able to shoulder the responsibility of being the sanguine's messiah. Yes, the baron's remains is only about £4,000. I'll have a lot of money left. I can even buy a few more dolls and give them some new clothes." Emlyn unconsciously straightened his back and began to walk more and more proudly. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek lit some candles and prepared for the sacrificial ritual. The lightning frequency alternated several times before he finally found an opportunity. He was very sure that the chief wasn't be able to keep an eye on him at this moment, because he had left the City of Silver with the little boy, Jack, who had recovered somewhat, and a group of explorers, in search for the so-called route that led from the coast to the destroyed city. It didn't take long for Derek to set up everything and say Mr. Fool's honorific name in a reverent, low voice. He very skillfully and methodically sacrificed the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch needed by Miss Magician, and the Beyonder ingredients designated by Mr. hanged man to the ruler above the gray fog. There were many cracks on the City of Silver's solid city walls, but they were filled to the brim with black hard soil. Strands of dense weeds grew on them, swaying in the wind like human hair. All of a sudden, all of them stood up as if they wanted to capture something, but they turned limp without any strength left in them. Early morning, at the Cathedral of Waves. Alger Wilson, who had come to collect the bounty, heard an important piece of news from the diocese bishop Chogo. Letitia Dolra of the Moses Ascetic Order had disguised herself as an archaeologist and entered the depths of the jungle on Saimim Island. It was unknown what she did that inflicted grievous injuries to See God Calvatua, who had been in hiding for years, pushing it to the verge of collapse. As a result, it was frantically searching for an opportunity to survive. Rumor has it that this evil spirit which calls itself See God had been discovered by two powerful cardinals of the military a long time ago. After it was defeated by them through the use of a sealed artifact, it could only barely escape and hide. This situation has persisted for more than 100 years. Without any intrinsic changes, why would it suddenly collapse and be unable to maintain its existence? Alger frowned slightly, wondering what the difference was. Situation deliberately created by the Moses Ascetic Order. But why didn't they do so in the past 100 years? To complement one of their other plans. Between speculation and doubt, Alger suddenly became aware of an important fact. The biggest and most fundamental difference between the last 100 years and now was that the world had come to Bayan. Mr. Fool's adorer had come to the Rorsted archipelago. Does his appearance anywhere indicate that something big is about to happen or is brewing? Previously, it was the great smog of Backland, and there was the abnormality in Banzi Harbor. Now there's the dying struggle of Sea God Calvatua and the unknown plot of the Moses Ascetic Order. No, to be precise, wherever a major problem is brewing or about to happen, Mr. Fool's adorers will be there. They accept Mr. Fool's arrangements and pursue the activities of those secret organizations, the evil gods and angels. As soon as his train of thought changed, Alger was suddenly enlightened, feeling as though he had grasped the truth. It's not that things happen wherever the world is, but that the world and the other adorers will appear when something is about to happen. What good does this bring to Mr. Fool? Is it a plot solely to destroy the enemy's schemes, or does it help him lift his seal and release more power? Alger held back his doubts and decided to seize the opportunity to submit some intel from before. He clenched his right hand into a fist and pressed it against his left breast. He said with a look of hesitation, "Your Excellency, while pursuing the remnant forces of steel, I heard a piece of intel." "What is it?" Chogo had originally planned to send this bishop-ranked captain out into the sea to search for traces of the resistance, but he was forcibly interrupted by him. For a moment he felt irritated. Alger recalled and said, "Someone mentioned Banzi Harbor in a conversation. They mentioned that an abnormality had happened there, but the descendants of the Medici family were well hidden and didn't end up being discovered." Banzi Harbor abnormality. Chogo took a step forward and pressed. "What else did they say?" "Other than mentioning that there was a fallen bishop of the church, nothing else." "Your Excellency, is the Medici family a dark family of the fourth epoch?" Alger asked deliberately. Chogo's expression sank. "That's not something you should know." TLL reported to His Eminence Cotman at once. Cotman was a Church of Storm's cardinal, the Archbishop of Rorsted Sea, a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, and the true ruler of the Bayonder world in the archipelago, John Cotman. Chogo thought for a moment before asking, who was the person who mentioned this? "What does he look like?" Alger was long prepared. T don't know them, and they never showed up again. T remembered that the person mentioning Banzi Harbor and the Medici family was an ordinary-looking young man with a thin face, a broad forehead, black eyes, and black hair. He wore a monocle. He seemed to notice that I was eavesdropping, but he didn't show any anger. Instead, he smiled at me. Alger had been describing blasphemer Ammon. He wanted the cardinals to believe that the exposure of the secret regarding the Medici family and Banzi Harbor was the result of a struggle between the kings of Angel. This is really a suitable person to use as a reason. He wouldn't appear to defend himself, and even if he did, no one would believe it, and clearly, any divination regarding him would have zero results. If Bayonder means are used to confirm my information source, there will be strong signs of interference from Mr. Fool, and they won't be able to get an accurate answer. From the looks of it, this is equivalent to what Ammon did, Alger thought with considerable relief. Chogo nodded lightly. Find these people and trace the whereabouts of the resistance. Yes, Your Excellency, Alger answered with a look of piety and struck his right fist on his left breast. Dark clouds covered the sky as the rain fell down in torrents, creating white fog in the process. In the port of Bayam, the blue water rose slowly but firmly, and the freighters and liners rocked like leaves fluttering in midair. The rain continued to fall, and the sea level gradually approached the dike. The city was flooded with water in many places, and the environment was greatly suppressed. One by one, the fanatical and numb locals in their taraba shirts and tattered jackets came to the edge of the cliff or the dike before jumping into the sea. Their flesh and skin rapidly lost moisture as they fell, and they were already desiccated corpses by the time they fell into the sea. A group of people were rioting as they hugged a Navy sailor who was walking out of a base. They angrily bit him to death with their teeth, reducing him to a mangled, bloody mess, and caused chaos on the streets. Whoosh! Boom! The dike collapsed, and the rising seawater poured into Bayam City. When Klein jolted awake, his mind was filled with the scene from his dream. For a seer, this was a very clear revelation. See, God Calvatua has failed to find a way to survive and has completely given up, resulting in it going completely mad. It wanted to create a storm, stir up a tsunami, and drown the Rorsted archipelago so that countless can join it in death. At the same time, its devotees are starting to do extreme acts. I've already informed the Church of Storm. They'll likely be able to stop it. No, even if I didn't inform them. They'll definitely be able to sense a problem with the appearance of such a situation. They would then make the necessary response. Klein rolled to his feet, wore his clothes, and walked out of his bedroom. He saw blazing Danet standing by the window, looking out. He saw the clouds hanging low as rain poured down, as though it was endless. A sign has appeared. Klein walked over to Danitz, who was also looking out at the repressive weather. He could faintly hear the abnormal sound of the tide. In the midst of silence, the sound of explosive thunder suddenly rang out in the air. The leaden-colored clouds quickly split apart, and the falling rain lost its source. In the direction of the docks, everything returned to normal. The morning sun shone down from high up in the sky, bathing Bayam in holy light. Danitz hissed and said to himself, John Cotman changed the weather. John Cotman, the Church of Storm's cardinal and high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punisher. He suppressed Calvadua's powers. Klein retracted his gaze while in thought. Danitz heaved a sigh of relief. T was rather worried just now. Afraid that the sea god who's on the brink of a breakdown would create a disaster. But there's John Cotman. Seeing that Jamin Sparrow was silent, he continued adding, At sea, even the king of the 5 seas and Queen Mystic won't be his equal. Captain said he's a Sequence 3 demigod. The potion's name is It's Sea King. Sea King, upon hearing the name to John Cotman's sequence, the first thing Klein thought of was the complete honorific name of the Lord of Storms, the King of the Skies, the Emperor of the Seas, the Lord of Calamity, the God of Storms. Sequence 3 is Sea King. Sequence O contains the elements of Sea Emperor, so it does match well. I wonder what Sequence 0 of the storm pathway is called. Klein looked out the window again and saw that, although the weather was still gloomy, the morning sun was up. The sound of the tide had retreated, and the rain had stopped. He pulled back his thoughts and analyzed the situation from the information that Danitz had revealed. The potion name is Sea King, which means that the corresponding Sequence 3 demigod saints have to act as a Sea King. And all acting has one premise, which is that one possesses all the powers needed. As a Sea King, he would definitely be a powerful ruler of the seas that he controls even if there's a distance limitation. He would be able to walk freely on the seabed, cause tsunamis as he wishes, raise the sea level, and control marine life, fighting in their home ground. They're absolutely capable of suppressing all demigods of the same level. The King of the 5 Seas and Queen Mystic are roughly at this level as well. It's just that there are differences in strength because of the different degrees of digestion and their grasp on their power. But no matter what, as long as they're at sea, Sea Kings are nearly unbeatable with the abilities displayed by the Sea King, coupled with the oceanic environment. If one hasn't seen the eternal blazing sun, true creator, and other true gods, it's not incomprehensible that people would worship him, believe in him, and pray to him. Many of the deities who received primitive worship might be at this level. They might not even be angels. Yes, don't look directly at God refers to a true deity. Previously, see God Calvatua didn't give me such a feeling, nor did Ammon's avatar. Of course, I can't be sure if the actual body of a king of angels has some kind of attribute that also doesn't allow one to look directly at them. One is a sea god who's on the verge of collapse and at most, a sequence 3, while the other is a sea king who is in good condition and is able to use sealed artifacts at any time. The outcome is obvious. John Cotman would definitely be able to suppress Calvatua's madness to prevent the sea from drowning Bayan. He would prevent the entire Blue Mountain Island and its many cities from turning into a lost sea ruin. Just wait a few more days. Calvatua's madness will completely dissipate, which will end up resolving the matter. This is the simplest and most effective way to deal with the situation, and it wouldn't bring about any panic at all. Most people here wouldn't even detect anything amiss. However, there are also some problems. Firstly, there shouldn't be any other accident. It's a mystery what that archaeologist, Letitia, did in Samim Island. She had single-handedly orchestrated the death of the sea god. Perhaps the forces backing her, either the Moses ascetic order or the element dawn, might take the opportunity to seek something. This is the greatest dormant danger. Yes, there should also be a high-sequence Bayonder in the Governor General's office and the military. This is a colony base the kingdom has in the Sanya Sea. Things won't turn out too bad. Then, there are the fanatical believers who will most likely become sacrifices as Calvatua becomes madder and closer to its death. They are like stalks during the harvest, falling down in bunches. However, for the Church of Storms, this isn't too bad of a development. The most pious of the heretics would die with their deity, which would save them the trouble of screening and handling them. If they aren't too pious, they wouldn't be affected too much, and it's possible to reform them. The only drawback is that the Rorsted archipelago would be lacking in manpower for a long period of time. Although such a problem is troublesome, as long as they grit their teeth, things can be resolved. Thus, the Church of Storms, see King John Cotman is more likely to sit back and do nothing. Few. I wonder how many people will die in the native enclaves and slums because of this. Klein's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a uniform set of footsteps and a roar high in the sky. Instinctively, he looked up and saw airships painted in dark blue, with several cannon muzzles and machine guns sticking out, fly past him as they headed in different directions. On the main street, soldiers in red coats, white pants and black leather boots were lined up in neat rows. They were carrying rifles and dragging cannons, as contingents of them moved past. The tense and solemn atmosphere suddenly spread. This is a colony. Klein inexplicably felt mixed feelings as he sighed to himself. I wonder how long it will take the church to get rid of that sea serpent and find the place where it's hidden. That place is definitely a treasure trove with countless precious items. Danitz, whose main job was a treasure hunter, suddenly spoke, appearing both expectant and full of regret. His attitude had changed extremely quickly. He had already reduced the sea god to a sea serpent, using it as a pronoun. The church won't do anything other than keeping the matter suppressed. They'll see Calvatua perish just from waiting for a few days, of course. Members of the Church of Storms might not have that kind of patience, especially when I've heard that John Cotman's main job is being a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punisher. It's just that with the archipelago isolated overseas, he also works part-time as a cardinal to unify his authority. Perhaps his style of doing things is more like that of a mandated Punisher, the place where Calvatua is hiding. That ruin is almost integrated into the spirit world. Finding it wouldn't be so easy, otherwise it wouldn't have led such an abject existence until today. At this thought, Klein suddenly had an idea. Finding the ruin where Calvatua is hiding would be very difficult to find from the real world. Since it has already perished, it's not something that can be found in a year or so, unless more accurate information is obtained. But if the search was done from the spirit world would make it even harder to pinpoint its location, but it doesn't completely lack option. Snake of Mercury Will Ossipton had once done so with the help of his folded crane. I still have no idea how to do that exactly, but that's not important. I can ask Mr. Azek. Death's domain controls part of the authority of the spirit world. The underworld, or should I say hell, was created by Phoenix ancestor Gregrace in the spirit world. A thought flashed through Klein's mind. He took out the ancient and exquisite copper whistle, put it to his mouth, and blew into it. He believed that even if he returned to the bedroom or entered the washroom, the messenger's massive body would be discovered by Danitz, who similarly had a non-trivial spiritual perception, so he didn't avoid him. Danitz was imagining the treasures of sea god Calvatua when he suddenly felt a chill at his neck. He felt something inwardly, and he quickly activated his spirit vision before looking to the side. There he saw white bones spewing out from the floor and flying upwards, forming a giant skeleton with an illusory head that pierced through the ceiling. The skeleton slightly lowered its head. Its two pitch-black flames at its eyes were visible even through the ceiling. The oppressive feeling brought by its massive body made Danitz jump to the side. His body was half-bent, and he conjured a scarlet flame in the palm of his right hand. What kind of monster is this? Danitz looked at J.M. Sparrow in surprise, only to see him holding a copper whistle and lifting his head as he looked at the skeletal monster. Klein looked up at the huge messenger as the huge messenger looked down at him. Both parties seemed frozen in place. Tusk, I was too anxious. I summoned the messenger before I even wrote the letter. Should I make it stay here or let it return first and let it come back later? I'm J.M. Sparrow now. Yes, J.M. Sparrow. Klein didn't say anything. He indifferently withdrew his gaze, took his time to find a pen and paper, and he began to write the letter. He gave a general description of the matter regarding sea god Calvatua, but he concealed the fact that he had nearly been possessed and how he had to borrow the gray fog to dissipate the curse. He mixed in information about Calvatua's ruins, where it hid, when describing the dream he just had. Perhaps a solution can be produced using the spirit world, but I lack the corresponding knowledge and hope to receive your guidance. Klein folded the paper and turned to see that the messenger's hand had clenched at some point in time. He pretended not to notice anything and threw the letter up. The messenger paused for a second, then it opened its hand and caught the letter. Its body suddenly disintegrated, and its bones crumbled down, drilling into the floor. What was that? Danitz finally uttered a sound. Klein glanced at him and replied calmly, Messenger. Messenger? Danitz was stunned for a moment before understanding what he meant. Such a huge and terrifying monster is actually a messenger used for delivering letters. Indeed, there's a powerful secret organization behind J.M. Sparrow. If I had such a messenger, everyone on the ship would envy me. It would be really, really cool. Danitz thought of how he would brag and flaunt his messenger when he returned to the ship. Putting away Azek's copper whistle, Klein got a chair and sat down, prepared to eat breakfast in a while. After a while, he heard knocking at the door. Danitz warily went over, and with the help of the peephole, he noticed that the person at the door was a middle-aged man with a boat-shaped hat. Elend, how did you find this place? Danitz asked as he opened the door. The visitor was the captain of the White Agate, just Elend. With wrinkles at the corner of his eyes, Elend looked into the room and chuckled. When you were checking into this hotel, you used J.M. Sparrow's name for the registration. It's easy with a look. That's because this identity is quite proper and innocent. Besides, in the eyes of the Church of Storms, I belong to the military. Klein slowly stood up and said to Elend, What happened? Elend pointed outside and said, Bayham met with an accident, but it's not a big problem. The military has joined forces with the church, and they're currently conducting a search and arrest operation throughout the city. They're searching for a few powerful Bayonders who are archaeologists in name. In order to find the target as soon as possible, the military has used all their resources, but it's still not enough for such a large city. They believe that although you're of unknown origin, you're very friendly to us. They hope you can help with the search and prevent any accidents from happening. The corresponding remuneration will be available after the matter. This is all thanks to you for exaggerating my degree of friendliness. That is to say, after the Church of the Goddess and the Church of Steam and Machinery, I can once again receive money from the military. For a moment, Klein felt mixed feelings. Seeing that he didn't answer immediately, Elend added, Although there won't be any major problems, the earlier we find the target, the earlier we can control the corresponding disaster. And perhaps that might save a few more people. Klein fell silent for a moment before gently nodding. Okay. Curfew. Seeing J.M. Sparrow put on his coat and hat and pick up his cane, Danitz recalled that he had apparently been forgotten. He coughed once, and under the gaze of two pairs of eyes he said, Do I need to follow? It's best not to, who knows what would happen. Before this, we had only stopped at Banzi Harbor, but we ended up encountering a rather strange situation. Last night, I brought J.M. Sparrow to visit the Resistance's liaison, and ended up being involved with the sea god's curse. Today, if I were to follow this madman to search for Letitia and the other archaeologists, then who knows what would happen. Danitz looked down and glanced down at his left arm, which was still tied with a splint. In a matter of days, he felt that he had encountered more events than he had in months or even half a year. You can stay here, but someone will be here for the sweep later. Ellen laughed. Someone will sweep this area. And then the great pirate Blazing would be caught and turned into gold pounds. Danitz frowned and laughed drily. Aside from the reward, there aren't many opportunities to earn money from the military. Very willing to give it a try. The only problem is that you'll have to wait a few minutes. I'll don a disguise, Mr. Captain. I don't want to put you on the spot by causing unnecessary misunderstanding. If I don't disguise myself, for a great pirate like myself to engage in operations with the military and the church, it will only result in me being captured immediately. Danitz imagined himself being pressed down, having a knee crushing his back, struggling like a catfish. After thinking for a few seconds, Ellen took out an iron-black mask from his inside pocket and tossed it over. Just put it on. I will explain the rest. Yes, there's no need to waste time on useless disguises, Klein evaluated inwardly. Without a word, he turned the handle and walked out of the room. Ellen followed close behind, and Danitz hurried to catch up with them as he grabbed his coat and put on the iron mask. When they reached the street where there was a lot of flooding but no pedestrians on the streets, Klein pressed down on his hat and asked, "How do we start?" Ellen laughed. "In regions. My Bayonder job has some special characteristics. As long as I see the person in the flesh in a photo or a sketch, then I'll be able to firmly remember the target's appearance and obtain an additional sense on an extraordinary level. Yes, I can also detect any abnormalities and grasp indistinct traces. When put together, it allows me to do investigative sweeps in a rather effective manner." Sequence H, Sheriff of the Arbiter Pathway, Klein nodded thoughtfully and asked as they walked, "Do you have their belongings?" The poster Danitz had posted last night had a portrait of Letitia attached to it. Klein had used ritualistic magic to pray to himself and produce it. "No." Ellen shook his head. "We have yet to learn of their previous whereabouts. The only things that we can confirm is that they didn't return from Saimim Island until around 3 p.m. yesterday. And after 2 p.m., no passenger ships left the docks. And that due to the weather this morning, only entry is permitted. In other words, Letitia and company haven't left by boat yet." Klein understood what Ellen meant. Danitz suddenly let out a sneer. "That doesn't mean anything. Maybe they left Bayam yesterday afternoon and went to the other cities on the island." Blue Mountain Island was the largest island in the Rorstad archipelago. It was very large in size and had dense forests and rich mineral resources. Therefore, there were many cities on the island, and they were all built around fertile land with astonishing mineral resource reserves. For this wealth, the Lone Kingdom first bribed the indigenous princes, then forced them to use force, and finally set up the Governor-General's office. In a more efficient manner, it opened wide roads leading to cities and completed several important railways. This was in the form of establishing a corresponding railway company to sell shares and raise funds on the Backland Stock Exchange. Of course, these large projects were accompanied by the deaths of many local people, sinister construction workplaces, excessive work, almost slave-like treatment, and a fairly modest salary, which allowed bodies to be buried one after another under the roadbed and railroad tie. To this day, a large number of locals still loathe the railway, believing that it had swallowed a large amount of human life and brought about countless suffering. It was the symbol of an evil god and devil. Ellen turned his head to glance at Danitz and said, "If they leave by land, then there's nothing to worry about." "Why?" Danitz asked, puzzled. "It's very simple. The roads that lead through the forest are controlled by the resistance, and the majority of the resistance are believers of the sea god. Hence, how would Letitia and the others, who were responsible for Calvatua's breakdown, dare to pass through these regions at night? If they dared to, then it can only mean one thing. They didn't realize the severity of the consequences of what they had done in the sea god ruins on Saimim Island. This also negates the conjecture that either the Moses ascetic order or Element Dawn has other motives." Klein controlled the urge to shake his head, and he followed Ellen into another street. Without explaining anything, Ellen took out a notice and handed it to J.M. and Sparrow. "The main target is this woman. I drew this woman." Klein glanced at it before tossing it to Danitz. At this moment, they heard the intense sound of fighting coming from the side room. "She has been found?" Danitz asked the question Klein wanted to ask. "Probably not." Ellen shook his head. "According to the orders, the first thing to do when discovering the target is to release red fireworks. Once it appears, everyone will close in on that location. If one encounters other wanted criminals who they cannot handle alone, they are to release orange fireworks. Surrounding teams would rush over to reinforce them. If they're ordinary pirates or criminals, we are to handle them ourselves. Let's wait. Perhaps it's because the fireworks couldn't be released in time. While he was talking, the glass on the third story of the house facing the street shattered with a crack. A bear-like brawny man jumped down. His speed was extremely fast as he ran into the distance like a cheetah. At this moment, an enormous shadow enveloped him, and gattling sounds came from the sky above. The brawny man's body was almost torn apart by the machine gun fire as he fell to the ground without putting up any resistance. Blood flowed out and dyed the ground red. If the residents weren't forbidden to leave their homes, then they would have screamed. At some point in time, the airship had floated over, but it didn't stop and had turned toward another direction. Goltet. Danitz recognized the victim. Seeing Jam and Sparrow turn his head over, he forced a smile and said, "This is the leader of a pirate crew. He's from Fasak, with a bounty of 950 pounds. Fasak, so they really are savages. He actually ran on a curfewed street, completely unaware to be on guard of attacks from above. That's right. Some pirates spent the entire night in a drunken stupor. They have no idea that even airships have been dispatched. If he had planned his escape route, then he might have been able to dodge the machine gun fire." Klein looked away and watched the monster in dark blue paint fly over the roof. When Danitz saw the pirate's outcome, he was grateful that he had followed Jayaman out. Seeing that the alert over here had been lifted, Ellen didn't linger any longer and led Klein and Danitz to the area that he was in charge of. After walking quickly for 5 or 6 minutes, they saw a barricade at the intersection in front of them. Guns were mounted and cannons were set up. Lone soldiers in red uniform stood guard over the area in silence. On the other side of the barricade, 20 to 30 corpses lay scattered on the ground, forming a vanguard formation. Their clothes were tattered and their faces gaunt, clearly indicating that they were natives. A little further away, several young native children were hiding in the corner. They were quietly looking at them in fear. Their eyes were dark and their faces were dirty. Klein and company fell silent for a few seconds before circling around the area. Backlund Sherwood Burrow. Forrest lifted the ceramic cup from the table and felt the heat. She roused herself and quietly waited for any changes. The temperature of the hot water dropped rapidly, and a thin layer of ice appeared on the surface of the liquid. White frost appeared on the rim of the cup. "Im a trickmaster now," Forrest closed her eyes in delight. She didn't waste any time after receiving the spirit eater's stomach pouch, immediately concocting the potion and completing the advancement. She obtained quite a number of spells with lower potency. Among them, Forrest's favorites were fog, wind, flash, freezing, electric shock, and tumble, which made people slip. Only at this point did she feel that she was a complete beyonder. She was no longer someone who could only pass through walls or rely solely on ritualistic magic. At almost noon, Elland, with the help of Klein and Danitz, had completed most of the investigation. "Let's eat some bread and drink some water before continuing." He took off his boat-shaped hat and spoke with parched lips. Klein was about to nod when he saw an orange firework fly into the air not far away. Without hesitation, Ellen put on his hat and ran in that direction. "TLL, go and support them. Orange means other wanted criminals that cannot be dealt with. Who could it be?" Danitz said to himself with interest. He switched to a gait of raising his legs high as he proceeded forward, hoping that the battle would be over before he arrived. Then he saw Jam and Sparrow follow behind just Ellen, leaving him alone by himself. Glancing at the dark blue monster flying in his direction, Danitz let out a hollow laugh and quickened his pace. 2 minutes later, they arrived at their destination and saw a house with a lawn facing the street. 3 or 4 military personnel were lying on the ground. Their faces were pale, and their bodies were trembling as if they had been thrown into a frozen lake. The more Klein walked in that direction, the colder it felt. It was as if he had arrived in the polar regions. Soon, he discovered that the ditches outside the house were filled with thick snow. Just then, a burst of female laughter came from inside the house at varying pitches, alternating between craziness and strangeness. Ha-ha-ha, ji-ha-ha, ha-ha-ha, ji-ha-ha-ha. Danitz couldn't help but stop and touch his neck, which was covered in goosebumps, with his right hand. With a clanging sound, the window opened and a charred body flew out. It landed hard on the ground, as if it were caught in an inferno. With just a glance, Klein was able to recognize through his spiritual intuition that this was one of the three male adventurers who had followed Letitia. Exceeds expectations, the target appears to have been found. Klein looked away and made a rough judgment. As there were no portraits, the dead adventurer's face was burned black, which meant that Ellen clearly didn't recognize this as one of their targets. After observing the situation and listening to the creepy laughter for a few seconds, he pointed to the 3 or 4 military personnel lying outside the house. Drag them back first, then wait for the other teams to arrive before launching our attack. Ori, he hesitated for a moment. Then he raised his head to look at the approaching dark blue airship. Without another word, and without instructing Klein and Danitz, Ellen ran to the unconscious military personnel whose faces were purple. Taboo, taboo, tap. The closer he got, the weaker his steps became. In the end, his body became stiff, and every step he took became extremely difficult. Ellen, who had been the bosun of the Imperial Navy, was experienced. He decisively stopped moving forward and turned around slowly, walking back 1 step at a time. The more he walked, the smoother it became. However, he was still shaking uncontrollably. His eyebrows and temples were covered in a thin layer of frost. A quick freezing effect that defies common sense, an extreme cold reminiscent of a disaster. With Ellen's attempt, Klein was able to grasp the danger level of this area, and he could only sigh inwardly. Unfortunately, the sun brooch isn't able to produce actual heat. It's only a stimulation of one's mind. Although it can make a body generate clear effects, it will only allow a person to withstand this cold for 3 to 4 seconds at most. Looking at Ellen's chattering teeth and how he was unable to open his mouth despite wanting to say something, Klein's gaze swept over Danitz. He threw his cane and said in a low voice, "Fire." "Fire?" Danitz was stunned at first, but he quickly understood Jam and Sparrow. He had also witnessed the entire process of Ellen's failure. A scarlet fireball that couldn't be considered bright formed on Danitz's right palm, and he threw it towards the flanks of the military personnel. The fireball traveled for nearly 20 meters and then landed on the ground without creating an explosive sound. Instead, it quietly rose into the air. The scarlet pillar of fire emitted sizzling sounds as it continuously shrank and quickly dimmed. Suddenly, it expanded, as if it was in a desperate struggle before it perished. Klein, wearing a black tweed coat, jumped out and landed right next to the military personnel. He bent down and reached out with both hands and grabbed the man's clothes. Then he pushed his feet against the ground, exerted strength at his waist, and threw the man out. The military personnel immediately flew into the air, smoothly flying out before landing 10 meters away from the area, escaping the region with the coldest chill. After doing this, Klein snapped his fingers and lit a match in his pocket before the chill seeped into his body. The scarlet streams of flames gushed out like water, instantly enveloping him. By the time everything faded, Klein had disappeared from his location. Flames leaped out, flickering and extinguishing from time to time. With the help of Danitz's fireballs and his own matches, Klein constantly phased around in the extremely cold area, easily throwing out several military personnel. After 2 to 3 attempts, he carried the last member of the military back to his original position. Ellen had clearly recovered as he gave a thumbs up. "Team, very glad and honored to have made the decision to ask for your help today. Captain, I like your tactful praises. Also, remember to raise the remuneration." Klein nodded politely, half-turned, and looked at the open windows of the house. He heard the laughter grow stranger. Danitz pursed his lips to the side and silently cursed Ellen. "Did you not see the contribution I made? Although my fireball has become something akin to a prop for a magic show, it still made actual contribution. This guy's nickname is just Ellen, but he's not just at all." As he muttered, a shadow loomed over the area, and the airship had arrived in the air opposite them. "Evacuate the people in the surrounding houses," an officer shouted from the airship. After Ellen and 2 other teams cleared several nearby buildings, the airship lowered its altitude and adjusted its cannon muzzle. Boom, boom, boom. The cannons fired continuously, bombarding the house, which was still filled with creepy laughter. Hearing the explosions and seeing the flashes of flames, Klein sighed as he held his cane. This is the firepower bombardment he advocated. He had once proposed it in Tingen City, but was unable to put it into practice. And today, however, the overseas colonists were producing the real scene before him. Ellen and the others stood guard in different positions under the deafening sound of the cannons, so as to prevent the people or perhaps monsters inside from breaking out. Soon the house collapsed, and smoke rose from the piles of masonry. All the snow and ice was gone. Suddenly, a thick bolt of lightning flashed, openly striking the airship. Klein frowned. He saw that the airship was completely still, and heard a steam boiler produce a jarring sound. The dark blue monster in the sky lost some control. Significant amounts of smoke began to billow out as it began descending to the side. Seems like they're being shielded by ammunition and being protected by an outer layer of air. I thought it would cause an explosion, blasting the airship to pieces. Klein turned his full attention back to the collapsed house. When he initially felt the extreme coldness and saw the male adventurer's charred body, he thought he had met another demoness, one who grasped the witch potion formula. Having dealt with demonesses several times, he knew that beyonders of this pathway could control ice and black flames from Sequence 7. But that flash of lightning had made him reject this judgment. He believed that Letitia was indeed a member of the Moses ascetic order or element dawn, a real woman. The moment Klein arrived at this conclusion, the pile of bricks and wood were immediately lifted away. The bright red and charred figure crawled out, with its elbows used to prop it up from the ground. She was a female, and Letitia's original appearance could barely be recognized. This made Ellen and the others shocked to discover that they had already found their target. However, compared to before, Letitia's current state was both terrifying and miserable. Her body was covered in black spots. The artillery shells had torn open red holes that lined her body. White fascia that seemed to have a life of its own was squirming inside her body. The top of her head had split open, and her brain came oozing out, sticking to the surface like the palms of children overlapping each other. Her gray eyes were out of focus, one of them blazing with fire, the other flashing with lightning. Two heads that were screaming in pain were embedded at her abdomen below her chest. They were the other two male adventurers. Not only has she lost control, but she also appears to be corrupted. She was already severely injured from the previous bombardment, and her aura had dropped to an extreme level. Klein didn't take action and instead watched as the beyonders from the military began to attack. Psychic piercing, whip of pain, purifying bullets, and small-caliber gunfire were launched. With this series of attacks, Rampager Letitia, who only had enough time to crack the ground and spread the crack outwards, completely broke down and became a dismembered corpse. Puh! Her torso fell to the ground, and the heads of the two male adventurers rolled out. Klein's eyes slightly narrowed. He discovered that there was a yellowish-brown book hidden within the flesh and blood of Letitia's abdomen. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven, Book of Calamity. Why do these books and notebooks always find themselves in the stomachs of people? It's the same as the Antigonus family's notebook last time, Klein lampooned. Then he suspected that the Book of Calamity was the item that the fake archaeologist, Letitia, had taken from the ruins of the sea god. At this moment, some military personnel grabbed the two male adventurers' heads, who still seemed capable of speaking, and hurriedly asked, "What did you do in the ruin of the sea god?" "Sea god's ruins," one of the male adventurers answered with pain and confusion. "We haven't been there." He tried to move his eyes to check the situation below his neck. "The sea god ruin in Simim Island," the military personnel reminded him. "No, we didn't." The male adventurer wanted to shake his head, but he couldn't do so. "We went to an ancient elven ruin. Letitia found a book there. She liked it very much. She quickly began to study it, then she went mad. She's crazy." As the male adventurer shouted out, whatever was left of his mind completely dissipated. "It's not a lost temple of the sea god, but a ruin of the ancient elf. This is different from what I imagined." Klein was about to listen carefully when Ellen came over and politely asked him and Danitz to distance themselves from the interrogation. Turning into another street, Klein slowed down and thought about the whole thing. Why would Letitia's act of taking the Book of Calamity out of the ancient elven ruins cause sea god Calvatua to be no longer capable of maintaining its existence, slowly bringing it to the point of breakdown? What's the connection between the two? Elves sea god, according to Little Sun, the ancient god, Elf King Sonithrim, wielded the present authorities of the Lord of Storm. That is to say, the elves no doubt possess Sequence 3 Sea King, or an even higher Sequence 2. Could it be that it was by chance that this sea serpent, Calvatua, discovered a ruin of the elves at the bottom of the sea, directly devoured the beyonder characteristics left behind by a certain high elf, and was lucky enough to survive the two possibilities of death and losing control? As such, it succeeded in acquiring the rank of a demigod, and gradually gained the faith of the Rorstad Archipelago's native. Klein slowly came to a realization, and he had to thank Mr. Hanged Man for this. Initially, Little Sun didn't reveal the corresponding authorities of the 8 ancient gods, but later, under the guidance of the Hanged Man, he explained some things, including the Elf King Soniathrum general situation. As for devouring Beyonder characteristics or the corresponding ingredients to advance, it wasn't something that didn't happen. Before the potion system was fully constructed, the human ancestors had made similar attempts to obtain Beyonder power. However, only a very small group of extremely fortunate people had managed to survive to become Beyonders without becoming monsters, lunatics, or dying on the spot, with their flesh and blood falling apart. Such an attempt had a 1 in 1,000 chance of success, or even a 1 in 10,000 chance. After the potion system was established, no one was willing to take such a great risk. If that's the case, then Calvatua was indeed very lucky back then. Of course, there's also the factor of its strong physique. However, its intelligence didn't seem to increase much, only being capable of deceiving its believer. It didn't actually find any traces of the elven ruins on Simim Island, and how it's closely related to the one it's hiding in. After Letitia and company took the Book of Calamity, that ruin collapsed, causing Calvatua's hiding spot to experience abnormalities, resulting in the barely surviving Calvatua to be unable to hold out any longer. This can explain how Letitia and company managed to easily succeed. There aren't any members of the Resistance or the Sea God's followers defending the area. Only when something happened did Calvatua discover the problem and realize the connection between the two ruins. With what he just gathered, Klein tried to explain what he had been wondering about the whole time. This included why the dying sea god Calvatua didn't allow its followers to become carriers. It would have reduced most of the accidents and made things easier. With the brutality Calvatua displayed, it was only right that it made such a choice. The answer Klein arrived at was that the body Calvatua wanted to corrupt and possess had to have a certain amount of elven blood, and that was the only way to survive the transfer of Beyonder characteristics up to a certain level. However, when Klein touched it, due to the gray fog and his uniqueness, it allowed Calvatua to instantly find a better target. Klein had just sorted out his thoughts when Ellen caught up with the two and said with a smile, "We've found the target. The investigation is over. I'll bring you back to the hotel first, and P'll bring the remuneration in 2 days. Also, it's best if you don't go out today." Klein maintained Jayaman Sparrow's character by only nodding slightly without giving any verbal response. On the way back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Dennis clearly had some doubts or wistful thoughts on his mind, but due to the presence of Ellen, who was part of the military, he could only change the subject and discuss with great interest about which pirates would end up being caught in the city's thorough sweep today. They weren't friends as long as those guys didn't belong to the Golden Dream. They weren't worth sympathizing with. After entering the hotel room and watching Ellen leave, he closed the door and said while clicking his tongue, "The Book of Calamity, Ancient Elven Ruins. This really is an interesting matter, but how did the elves end up like devils?" Just by casually taking their book, a casual flip through it had caused that woman to go insane and lose control. What kind of image do you have of elves? Living in the mountains and seas, specializing in cooking, creatures who enjoy nature. According to Little Sun, the 8 ancient gods before the cataclysm were all very tyrannical, very cruel, and very evil. Among them was the elf king Soniathrum, and the elves who believed in him and viewed him as their king couldn't have been any better. One can make a comparison with the members of the Aurora Order. The Beyonder races left behind by the Dark Epoch basically can't be associated with the good alignment that normal people have in mind, Klein replied in his mind. Of course, he didn't rule out the possibility that after the ancient gods' fall, the dragons, giants, elves, sanguine, and other living creatures would gradually extricate themselves from the negative effects and become more normal. However, this was only limited to the middle and lower levels, and it didn't include the demigod powerhouses. And the high elf that left behind the Book of Calamity was clearly the latter. With a thought, Klein suddenly realized something. Danitz understands Elvish. He recognized the title of the ancient goatskin book as the Book of Calamity. Vice Admiral Iceberg has actually taught her crew to such an extent. Not only does it include ancient Fasak, but she has also taught them Elvish, which can stir up the powers of nature. Perhaps Jotun and ancient Hermes are all part of the curriculum on the Golden Dream. They really are a bunch of pirates with knowledge and dreams. However, ma'am, Captain, aren't you being a little overboard on certain subjects? Danitz is lacking in so many other aspects, that's right. The most important thing for a pirate whose main job is to be a treasure hunter has to be mastering the ancient languages. Klein ignored Danitz's comments and looked out the window. The sky remained gloomy, as if a heavy rain would fall at any time. It made one involuntarily feel suppressed. Klein nodded slightly, feeling slightly relaxed as he thought. Letitia has been found. Being aware of the ancient elven ruin on Simim Island, the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military will likely use its connection to the place where Calvatua is hiding to find the sea god that is becoming progressively crazier. Or they might use the ruin to speed up its collapse. That way, apart from the most fervent and pious sea god believers dying, the rest basically won't suffer any harm. Klein had originally thought of using the spirit world to locate sea god Calvatua's hiding spot after it died before the official Bayonders did. He could then infiltrate it, taking the treasure with him. But even before the plan had begun, the appearance of the Book of Calamity pushed his plan to the verge of failure. Phew, it's fine. It only existed in my imagination, and it never belonged to me. It's fine if I don't get it. I don't even know what I'll get. Letting this matter get resolved this way is for the best. Klein withdrew his gaze from the weather, his mood calm and relaxed. He just inevitably felt a slight sense of loss. That day, he and Danitz followed Ellen's advice and didn't head out again. They only remained in the inn. In Bayham City, there would be the sound of gunfire and explosions from time to time. This continued until the sky turned dark. The next morning, Klein got up on time and found that there were layers of clouds in the sky, and the sky remained dark. This meant that the confrontation between the Church of Storms Cardinal, high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, John Cotman, and sea god Calvatua was still ongoing. Klein felt pain in his stomach and prepared to head to the washroom with the newspaper. However, he gave up on that idea when he saw Danitz leisurely reading a newspaper while lying in a reclining chair, munching on a piece of white bread in his mouth. Reading the newspaper while on a toilet doesn't match J.M. and Sparrow's persona. Although it would be boring, I mustn't slack off on acting. Sigh. I've once again found a difference in the behavior between my true self and my disguised identity. Klein summed it up in silence and went into the washroom. He took off his pants and sat down on the toilet, staring almost in a daze at the pale white wall in front of him, as if he could read words from it. At this moment, his spiritual perception was triggered. He hurriedly tapped his molars and activated his spirit vision. Two thick, long white bones appeared in front of him. They were the messenger's legs. The messenger stood there, its head passing through the ceiling, but its black flames in its eye sockets could still be seen. It lowered its head slightly and looked down at Klein, who was sitting on the toilet. Klein looked up, stunned for 2 seconds, his mind filled with a baffling thought. Should I act like a woman, hurriedly covering my nether regions, or should I just be open and fearless? Before he could make up his mind, the messenger dropped the letter, disintegrated into a pile of bones, and disappeared into the floor. It took a moment for Klein to react before he caught Mr. Azek's reply. This messenger is being more and more impolite. Can't you see that I'm using the toilet? Don't you know to knock on the door or to squeeze it through the crack under the door? Klein cursed it in anger and amusement. After giving it some more thought, he felt that it would be putting the messenger in a tough spot to pass the letter through the crack in the door. The 4-meter-tall giant had to lie down in order to reach that position. Just thinking about it is rather funny. Well, the next time I write a letter, I'll add a paragraph so that Mr. Azek can educate the messenger so that he will be more polite. Klein unfurled the letter and read Azek's reply. According to the knowledge I've recalled, I can provide you with 2 methods. The first requires certain prerequisites. If a unique item belonging to you or someone else is located where sea god Calvatua is, you can use divination to easily locate its position. The other prerequisite is that you can enter the spirit world. I have plenty of methods for this. He'll list the most common 3. The second method is to use a secret deed, ritual, and pray to Red Light Air Moria. He represents authority and will. At a certain level, he grasps the relevant knowledge of the creatures in the spirit world and the locations in the spirit world. So Red Light of the 7 pure lights is named Air Moria. The principle of a secret deed ritual is to adjust one's state, release one's mind and body, and align oneself with the target of the prayer bit by bit. Finally, an overlapping will occur, allowing one to acquire the corresponding knowledge. And this kind of alignment and overlapping is relative. While acquiring knowledge, my secrets will also be open to the target of the prayer. I can't trust Red Light. I have too many secrets. Klein's first reaction was to rule out the second approach. As for the first solution, there was also the chance of failure. Klein didn't have any unique items located or see God Calvatua hid itself. Either I use the help of the resistance and send something to Calvatua, or I'll have to find the original owner of an item sacrificed to see God from its believer. Furthermore, it has to be unique. Send something to Calvatua, as he thought. Klein suddenly had an idea. He braced himself and considered it over and over again, thinking that there was a certain probability of success. After finishing his deed in the washroom, Klein washed his hands, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. He planned on attempting divination and received a revelation that there was danger, but it was manageable as long as it was handled properly. With all of this done, he returned to the living room and walked towards the reclining chair. Danitz immediately sat up and said with a dry laugh, "Is there something? Do you know the words to the prayer relating to the sea god?" Klein asked with an unperturbed tone. Danitz spread out his hands and suddenly hissed. "Dogshit," he softly cursed at his injured arm and switched to smiling. "Yes. I've seen a few members of the resistance hold ritual. The details are, adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvatua." By the way, the 2 instances that it was effective were recited in Elvish. Adorer of the sea and spirit world, its bearing is very low. It's not the same as my honorific name, that's true. I created it by copying it from the 7 true gods. Klein nodded gently and said, "Do you know where there are empty warehouses and abandoned houses?" "Of course. Every great pirate knows a few," Danitz replied without hesitation. Klein turned around and walked towards the coat rack. "Take me there." "To do what?" Although Danitz was puzzled, he didn't dare ask. "In the dock area, in a dirty and dilapidated warehouse." Danitz watched J.M. and Sparrow take out 3 candles and several metal bottles. Unable to hold back his curiosity any longer, he asked, "What are you planning on doing?" Klein didn't look back and replied very calmly, "Sacrifice." "To whom?" Danitz pressed with interest. Klein set up the altar, took out an iron cigar case and calmly said, "Calvatua." His plan was to give something directly to see God Calvatua. As long as Calvatua accepted it, he could use divination and other methods to find its hiding place. As for whether or not Calvatua would accept it, he had certainly considered it, believing that it was a definite possibility. As Calvatua was currently on the verge of death, it was in a state of extreme madness, with little sense of reason. It acted on instinct alone, and it might have a strong desire for the aura of the gray fog. Therefore, Klein was prepared to sacrifice an iron cigar case that was often placed above the gray fog. He wanted to see if Calvatua would accept it or not, and if he didn't, he wouldn't suffer any losses. He could then pretend as though nothing had happened. Sacrifice to see God Calvatua. At that moment, Danitz found his brain lacking. He couldn't comprehend what was on J.M. and Sparrow's mind. "Are you crazy? How could it accept your sacrifice? Even if it's accepted, what would be the point? It's dying, and it's very dangerous," Danitz blurted out. Immediately, he added inwardly, "No, J.M. and Sparrow isn't crazy because he has always been crazy." Klein glanced at him and simply said, "In this domain, I'm an expert. When it comes to sacrificial rituals, I'm an expert." Klein wasn't modest about this. Calvatua Danitz felt choked, unable to say a word. He quickly stepped aside and watched as J.M. and Sparrow lit the candles, burned some powder, and dripped some extract. Taking in the smell that pervaded the air, he couldn't help but raise his voice. "Why, you're using the wrong materials, right?" He remembered that the resistance didn't use things like full moon essence oil, slumber flower, or chamomile when sacrificing to the sea god. "It's not like you're praying to the Evernight goddess." Klein turned his head to look at him, then he returned his gaze to the altar. "That wouldn't be an issue." As a professional who often offered and received sacrifices, he was very aware that the burning of extracts, essential oils, and herbal powder mainly had 2 uses. One was to help the ritual's host to better adjust his spirituality and enter the proper state, and the other was to please the corresponding deity, to please the target of the sacrificial object, and to increase the probability of a response. In this aspect, every deity had certain characteristics and preferences. This sacrifice, on the other hand, mainly relied on Calvatua's abnormal state of mind. It had gone completely crazy, and it thirsted for the gray fog's aura. Neither of the two could be missing, and everything else wasn't important. As long as the aforementioned two conditions were satisfied, pleasing Calvatua or not didn't affect the ritual. It neither increased the success rate, nor would it increase the possibility of failure. It could be completely handled in a perfunctory manner. If Calvatua still retains its reason, and even if I were to strictly follow the requirements of its ritual, do you think it would respond to me? Klein silently lampooned and took half a step back, ready to start the most important part of the ritual. He thought for a moment, then without turning his head he said directly, "Stay further away." Me? Instead of getting angry, Danitz was overjoyed. He quickly nodded. "All right, okay." He rushed to the door of the warehouse, planning to escape the moment something went wrong. Klein half closed his eyes, cogitating about the countless spherical lights that overlapped each other, and he quickly entered the proper state. He chanted softly in Elvish, "Adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvatua. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. T pray for you to take this offering. T pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." As he said the awkward sentences one after another, the sound of wind rose within the wall of spirituality, as if it was going to overturn everything. Klein's clothes fluttered in the wind, as he took out another small metal bottle that he had prepared beforehand. He poured about 5 milliliters of the remaining thousand-faced hunter's blood into the air. This was a material filled with spirituality. The strong wind sucked the drops of blood, howling as it drilled into the candle flame that symbolized sea god Calvatua. Without a sound, the candle flame burgeoned to form an illusory door. On the surface, there were symbols and magic labels. From the inside, the faint sound of crashing sea waves could be heard. Suddenly, all signs of movement vanished. There was only the sound of breathing that reverberated through the illusory door, as though there was something hiding behind it, something massive that was suppressing its hunger with great difficulty. Huff, 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 the sound of the loud, heavy breathing became clearer and clearer, to the point that even despite being situated at the door of the warehouse, Dennett still felt his scalp tingle. Bang! The illusory door suddenly opened, and something that visibly resembled a hurricane poured out. Amidst the sharp wailing sounds, Dennett felt the invisible wall of spirituality shatter. He discovered that he had been thrown into the air like a small boat in a storm. He slammed into the door, producing a dull thud. He fell outside the warehouse, his back scuffed from several wooden splinters. The scarlet fireball that he had instinctively condensed in his hand instantly dimmed and was quickly extinguished in the hurricane, like a candle that was about to burn out. While he was flying in midair, he saw what looked to be a bloody, gaping mouth appear behind the illusory door. It revealed milky white sharp teeth, which was slightly curved and longer than a human arm, as it madly smashed against the illusory door in a bid to enter the real world. Its beast-like howls first echoed inside the warehouse, causing Danitz to bleed from his ears and nose. Klein also flew up into the sky as a result of the hurricane, and his line of sight was immediately occupied by a bloody, forked and massive forked tongue that burst forth with sparking lightning. His body was scorched black as it stiffened in the air. Forked tongue pierced through his body as it was reduced to ashes. Klein's figure appeared on the other side. His hat had fallen off, and his clothes were messy. He looked rather wretched. Fortunately, he knew that a situation would occur, and he knew that there was going to be danger. He had constantly been on high alert, and he didn't let down his guard as he used paper figurine substitutes just in time. At this moment, Calvatua, who was situated behind the unperturbed, illusory door, finally realized that its violent blows had no effect and stopped. It took a deep breath and caused the blue seawater to gush in from all directions. Water then collapsed into a whirlpool that emitted a terrifying suction force. It was so powerful that it could swallow a cargo ship. The iron cigar case on the altar flew into the vortex. The tiny cauldron containing some herbal ashes flew up and into the whirlpool. Many objects within the warehouse, along with the soil, were thrown into the whirlpool. Klein also flew up, as he found it difficult to resist being thrown into the whirlpool. He tried to snap his fingers to ignite flames and leap out of the whirlpool's reach, but the suction force and the hurricane spoiled his plan. His figure suddenly became thinner, turning into a paper figurine. As the paper figurine fell into the whirlpool, Klein, who had emerged from another position, once again soared into the air, unable to extricate himself from the terrifying suction force. At this critical moment, he no longer hesitated. He made the black glove he wore on his left palm turn pale, as it was tinged with a slightly dark green color. He activated Creeping Hunger, and he directly used Steel Maveti's soul. Klein's body suddenly grew heavy as he pushed forward with his left palm. An ice wall that wasn't too thick solidified in front of him, helping him temporarily isolate Sea God's whirlpool. Taking advantage of this, Klein landed, his feet heavily landing on the ground as he sank deep into the ground. Catcha! The ice wall lasted only a second before it was shredded to pieces by the boundless suction force, and the remnants flew into the huge sea serpent's throat. Relying on the strength of a zombie, Klein used both of his feet to hold himself in place and no longer flew up again. However, he was still unable to stop himself from sliding towards the illusory door, where Calvatua's gaping mouth was. He drew 2 deep ravines on the ground in the process. Outside the warehouse, Danitz wasn't affected by the suction force of the whirlpool. Instead, he tried condensing a fireball to throw to the side, allowing Jam and Sparrow to jump out of his predicament and escape. Unfortunately, the flames were extinguished again and again by the hurricane. As Klein drew closer to the illusory door, he could smell the stench of blood and decay. Right in front of him were milky white fangs that emitted a chilly air. His thoughts raced, and he quickly came up with a solution. The solution was simple. It was to throw out the all-black eye that originated from Nimble Right Master Rasago. Since you want to make a whirlpool in the sea in a bid to devour everything, I will make you consume another bottle of a Beyonder potion without any supplementary ingredients, as well as the mental corruption of the true creator. If that's the case, I don't believe that you, who's already on the verge of collapse, will be able to hold on. Klein gritted his teeth and reached into his pocket. Perhaps it had sensed his malicious intent, or perhaps it had lost its patience, but at this moment, Calvatua suddenly raised its head and let out a long howl, causing the seawater whirlpool in his throat to collapse and disintegrate into countless water droplets which sprayed out of the illusory door. Splash! Torrential rain fell in the warehouse, and a dazzling silver ball of intertwined lightning condensed in Calvatua's throat once again. With a boom, it spat out that lightning ball. Amidst the torrential rain, the silver ball of lightning transformed into streaks of stunning lightning bolts that quickly expanded outward. It destroyed the frugal altar and occupied the entire warehouse. Sizzle! Klein's figure kept phasing in and out of existence amidst the sea of lightning. His body would char and turn into scraps of paper. Outside the warehouse, Danitz also suffered its effect. All his hair stood up as his body convulsed. After continuously using paper figurine substitutes and approaching his limit, Klein finally managed to withstand it until the lightning subsided. As for the illusory door, it was affected by the complete destruction of the ritual and quickly closed. Krieg! See God Calvatua's hisses of indignation were isolated by the door. After a moment, the illusory door completely disappeared. The surroundings were in a wretched mess. Only a candle was left on the altar, weakly swaying its flame. Bang! Danitz leaned forward against the warehouse's wall, barely standing at the doorway. He tried to speak, but he couldn't stop convulsing. He could only express his grievance with his eye. Jam and Sparrow is really a madman. I can still remember the horror I experienced in Banzi Harbor, and I still have nightmares about it. Previously, when he was picking out items offered by the Resistance, he attracted the curse of the sea god. I was so frightened that I almost ran away while on our journey back. This time, he even did some sacrificial ritual and nearly summoned Calvatua over. It was really extremely dangerous just now. Why does he love to take risks so much and enjoy causing major trouble? Time after time, he searches for thrills while on the brink of death. Is this a manifestation of his craziness, or is there another reason? See, God Calvatua is still very strong. Even though it's on the brink of death, and there's the door of sacrifice in between us, it was still able to release a portion of its strength that could easily finish me off. As expected of a demigod that can fight against a sea king, Klein pulled his feet out of the ground and saw that his boots were in tatters. At the same time, he found that, regardless of it being due to luck or an inevitability, Calvatua had accepted his sacrifice in all sense of the word. This was because the huge sea serpent had swallowed the iron cigar case, which had been tainted with the gray fog's aura, and many other things while producing the whirlpool. In other words, I can try to locate its hiding place in the spirit world, but I'll have to wait for its death so that it can't interfere and resist my divination. This search would require me to enter the spirit world, and I can't keep using the gray fog forever. Klein quietly let out a breath. He felt the glove on his left hand become filled with an indescribable madness and hunger. It seemed like it was going to devour the wearer if it wasn't fed. There are no sinners around. Klein turned his head to look at Danitz, who was standing by the door. Danitz's mind suddenly tightened. He felt as if he was being targeted by a monster and was about to become food for the other party. The hunger he felt at a spiritual level had made him tremble slightly. He yearned to immediately turn around and flee. Then he heard Jam and Sparrow's indifferent voice. "Close the door from the outside." "All right." Resisting the residual pain from the electric shock, Danitz moved the door which had been sent flying open, barely closing the hole. Klein seized the moment to carry out a sacrificial ritual. He prayed to himself and responded to himself by throwing creeping hunger that was about to lose control above the fog. The mystical item that had frightened Danitz, so much so that he didn't dare to resist, immediately became docile, gentle, and tame. Upon returning to the real world, Klein extinguished the candles, put away the remaining items, and carefully checked the situation in the warehouse. Luckily for him, the whirlpool of seawater created by Calvatua had completely wiped the area clean, leaving only the subsequent sprays of rain, the blackened patches from the lightning strikes, and sparse piles of ash, as well as the ravines produced by Klein's 2 feet. The traces are easy to deal with. I can get Danitz to use his fireball to wash the place later, disguising it as an internal strife between pirates. Klein nodded indiscernibly and pulled out one of the few remaining paper figurines. He shook his forearm and flicked his wrist. The paper figurine flew out and burned on its own before turning into black ash. After doing all of this, Klein walked towards the door, frowning as he walked. The soles of his boots were gone, and the rest of his clothes were tattered and torn, wet, or charred. This was unavoidable under those circumstances, as it wasn't something a paper figurine could withstand. The tearing was a result of the potent suction from the whirlpool. The moist sensation came from Calvatua's torrential rain, and the charred black marks were a result of being struck by bolts of lightning in the interval when Klein was using his paper figurine substitutes. Even now, despite having calmed down, his right forearm still spasmed a few times due to the electric shock. "It cost me £8.6 solely. I have to get a new set of clothes." I had divined danger and had made preparations, but I didn't expect Calvatua to be more powerful and crazier than I had expected. I hope that I'll gain something later. Klein silently shook his head. He restrained his expression and endured the pain before coming to the door and knocking 3 times. Danitz, who was constantly uneasy, hesitated for 2 seconds before he opened the door. Discovering that Jam and Sparrow had returned to his cold and reserved state, with him no longer emitting a hunger and madness that struck terror to his spirituality, Danitz let out a sigh of relief. He took a glance inside and asked, "Is it over?" "No." Klein curled the corners of his lips and revealed a gentle smile. "Not yet." Danitz jumped in fright. What else needs to be done?" Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness. "A cleanup is still necessary. That's basic courtesy." "A cleanup?" Danitz was stunned. Raising his right hand, he pointed at himself and said, "Me." The corners of Klein's mouth widened. "Or shall I do the honors? Then I would be eaten by creeping hunger." Danitz let out a hollow laugh. "How should I clean this place?" "Use a fireball," Klein answered simply. As a part-time pirate, it didn't take much effort for Danitz to understand Jam and Sparrow's intention. He walked past him and headed for the interior of the warehouse. During this process, he had a few questions in his mind which were quite puzzling. Captain said that creeping hunger needs to devour a living person every day, but Jam and Sparrow can only satisfy it after a battle. He usually doesn't bother with it. Besides, in that battle just now, Jam and Sparrow had used Steel Maveti's ice power. He didn't feed it after. Strange. What secret lies behind this? A seal of a certain level? Or can it be that the organization behind him is capable of sealing creeping hunger? As Danitz cleaned the warehouse, Klein stood outside, looking up at the overhanging dark clouds, looking forward to what would happen next. "I've already sent the iron cigar case that's tainted with the gray fog's aura over, so all I need to do is wait for Calvatua, a fake sea god, to collapse and die. I hope the Bayonders of the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military won't have the time to find it in time, or leave behind some items of certain value that they think little of." Klein slowly took in a deep breath, listening to the dull bombardment sounds coming from behind him. In a hotel, Alger stood at the window, staring out at the overcast sky. I received the sanguine's anesthetic gas not long after the last tarot gathering. I was prepared to go out to sea to gather ingredients, but a week has passed, and I'm still stuck in Bayam. The corners of his mouth twitched as he shook his head. First, there was the incident of the world-hunting steel Mavetti. It earned him quite a sizable amount of money, and then he had to wait for the reward. After that, when the reward was obtained, he encountered the breakdown of that sea serpent, Calvatua, and was ordered to search for the adventurers and archaeologists, Letitia and company. I heard that during the investigation yesterday morning, Letitia and the others were found. The mandated punishers and the military seemed to have obtained some important clues, and quite a number of them went to Saimim Island. This is something that I'll never have dibs on. Alger retracted his gaze, pulled up his short robe that didn't reach his knees, and muttered to himself. Let it end as soon as possible. Once Calvatua was completely dead, and the tsunami was no longer a latent risk, he could leave the harbor. After leaving the city of generosity, Bayam, he could work at advancing to sequence 6 Wind Blessed. As his mind whirred, Alger's heart skipped a beat and he turned around to look out the window. He saw the clouds high in the sky quickly dissipate, with the crimson moon quietly hanging in the sky. Klein slept until midnight when he was suddenly jolted awake. He had vaguely sensed something. He rolled out of bed, went to the window and pulled back the curtains. Crimson moonlight shone in, covering everything like frost. It was cold and dreamy. Klein looked out and saw that the clouds which hung low had disappeared. The bright crimson moon was high in the sky amidst the sparse stars. This means that the confrontation between the sea god and sea king has ended. Klein pondered for 2 seconds, retracted his gaze, closed the curtain, took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. He sat at the end of the long, mottled table, took out a gold coin, and began to recite a divination statement in a low voice. Calvatua is completely dead. After he repeated this 7 times, he flicked the gold coin and watched it leap upwards and tumble down. The gold coin landed in Klein's palm, and the king's head faced up. It meant a positive result. It meant that sea god Calvatua was completely dead. As expected, the ancient elven ruins on Saimim Island and the hiding place which Calvatua used to maintain its existence are closely connected. The mandated punishers and the military have just received the Book of Calamity, and since they only learned about the ruins for a little more than a day before Calvatua couldn't hold out much longer, I thought it could forcibly survive for 2 or 3 more days. Klein sighed and tried to divine whether the official Bayonders had already entered Calvatua's hiding place. Unfortunately, due to the lack of information, his divination failed, and he was unable to obtain any revelation. After thinking for a while, Klein changed his angle, undid his spirit pendulum, and began to divine if it was dangerous for him to search and explore Calvatua's hiding place. As this involved himself, he quickly received a conclusion. The topaz pendant was rotating counterclockwise at a not-so-fast frequency and low amplitude. It's dangerous, but it's acceptable. The danger is even less than the sacrificial ritual. Klein nodded gently, returned to the real world, and began his preparations for his operation. He locked the bedroom door first, then he arranged the ritual to summon himself. Once again entering above the gray fog, Klein picked up the Dark Emperor card and placed it inside his spirit body. All of a sudden, he turned corporeal as if he was of flesh and blood. The surrounding black fog stuck to the surface of his body and formed a majestic aura. It was as if he was entirely clad in physical armor, but on his head was a gorgeous pitch-black crown. Looking at the human-skinned glove on the table, Klein hesitated to put it on. Above the gray fog, creeping hunger was almost in a sealed state. It didn't dare to make any unusual movements, but once it left the area, the uncontrollable hunger would cause harm to its wielder, whether they were alive or in spirit body form. Midst Klein's considerations was whether the Dark Emperor's high level could suppress the creeping hunger inside his spirit body and keep it normal. I'll give it a try. If it doesn't work, I'll end the summon and return here. This will hardly require any time, and there's no danger. Klein picked up creeping hunger and put it on over the iron-black armor gauntlet. He didn't hesitate any longer and stepped into the door of summoning. With the help of the expanding candle flame, he arrived in the real world. Without being careless, Klein's first reaction was to check the state of creeping hunger. He found it calm and submissive, subservient to the high level of the Dark Emperor. Not bad. With a sigh of relief, Klein placed the mystical items, such as Azek's copper whistle, the biological poison bottle, and the sun brooch, into his body one by one. Finally, he picked up his black hardwood cane and prepared to use it to search for his lost iron cigarette case that had been tainted with the gray fog's aura. Of course, in order to find the place where Calvatua was hiding, one had to first enter the spirit world and pinpoint the location from within. Otherwise, it would only fail. As for how to enter the spirit world, Klein didn't consider the three methods provided by Mr. Azek. As a spirit body with intelligence and the ability to think, how was he not able to find the spirit world and enter it? He calmed down a little and recalled the scene of countless spherical light. His body and mind quickly became tranquil. His thoughts gradually became empty as his consciousness gradually extended and expanded. He soon discovered that he was surrounded by indescribable illusory, transparent things. All the colors became bright, distinct, but overlapping, and the gray fog had grown so faint that it seemed to cover everything in an ethereal manner. In the depths, high up in the sky, there were 7 rays of lustrous brilliances that shone with different colors. They seemed to possess life, and they contained immense knowledge. This was the spirit world. It completely overlapped with reality and was omnipresent. If I happen to encounter the mandated punishers or military personnel, I will immediately end the summoning and return above the gray fog. Klein took a step forward. After easily entering the spirit world, he felt his body become illusory. The black cloak behind him fluttered up slightly, and the hardwood cane in his hand stood upright. He said in a low, dignified voice, "The location of my unique iron cigar case." While chanting, Klein felt tense for a baffling reason. In the saturated and distinct colors of his surroundings, pairs of indifferent and eerie eyes glanced over. After repeating it 7 times, Klein released his grip and waited for the revelation. The black hardwood cane floating forward at an adequate speed which was neither too fast or slow. Klein followed it, flying through the real, the illusory, the strange and mysterious spirit world. Here, if he lost his bearings, it was very easy to end up completely lost and never be able to leave again. Of course, there wasn't a problem for Klein. If he really got lost, he could end the summoning and return directly to the space above the gray fog. Klein chased after the black cane, which was sometimes thrown and sometimes dropped, shuttling back and forth between distinct and overlapping colors. He passed by half-hidden spirit world creatures that couldn't be accurately described, and it was hard to know how far he had traveled. Suddenly he saw an eye. It was round, with clear blacks and whites. The eye looked at him without blinking. There was no head, nor was there a corresponding body. The huge eye, which had its blacks and whites clear, appeared translucent. It floated quietly behind saturated, overlapping colors. Klein couldn't tell if it was hostile or friendly. At this moment, Klein remembered a passage from the sites in the spirit world. The ancestor of the Abraham family had said, "Try not to cross eyes with any creatures of the spirit world for more than 3 seconds, unless they have already expressed interest in communicating with you. This is considered provocative behavior. Also, do not let yourself appear terrified and nervous. For some predators, this will increase their desire to attack." As the words flowed through his mind, Klein retracted his gaze and continued to chase after the flying hardwood cane in front of him at a rather adequate speed. The sight of the full black armor set and black crown he donned, matched with a cloak of the same color, entered the round eye. But the figure quickly passed by, disappearing far away. It didn't stir up the slightest change. In essence, the spirit world is a very dangerous place. If one isn't careful, one can encounter a terrifying existence at the demigod level. As Klein continued to make his way through, he realized that this place was truly chaotic. Although the 7 lustrous brilliances that could be used to mark his location remain high above, covering the sky, they could still be seen from time to time beneath his feet, to his left and right, and from the front and back. If not for his black cane, Klein wouldn't have been able to determine his bearings. Suddenly, through the faint fog of the void, he saw, on his left, based on a normal human being's concept of left, a floating castle. It was entirely black in color. Its spire towered, and it was covered with vines, extremely reminiscent of a Gothic style. At the top of the castle stood a translucent woman who was almost as tall as the castle. She was wearing a complex, gorgeous, dark and gloomy black dress. She didn't have a head, and there was a neat cut by her neck. Her drooping hands held 4 blonde heads with red eyes. If one looked closely, they would find that these brilliant-looking heads were exactly the same. When Klein, who was disguised as the Dark Emperor, passed by, the 4 heads the woman carried blinked. Klein didn't respond as he flew forward as though he hadn't seen her. The woman slowly turned her body, letting the heads in her hand watch him depart. What kind of monsters are these? As the thought flashed through Klein's mind, he saw the black cane plummet rapidly. He hurriedly chased after it, once again experiencing the feeling of a free fall. About 8 seconds later, a faintly discernible collapsed building appeared in front of him. Outside of the building floated a spirit world creature which resembled a giant jellyfish. It extended transparent, sticky tentacles and pulled the surrounding area into its own territory. At the end of each tentacle grew a white skull with deep eye sockets. It kept shaking as it floated about with light but slow movement. The black cane passed through the strange creature of the spirit world and hovered in front of the almost illusory collapsed building. Found it. Klein was delighted at first before he solemnly glanced at the giant jellyfish that was waving its skull. He made preparations for battle, but he didn't attack immediately. Instead, he tried to emit the profound dignity that came with the high level of the Dark Emperor car. His eyes indifferently stared at the eye sockets that were deeply recessed. After 3 seconds of frozen silence, Klein said Ancient Hermes in a low voice, "Leave." The tentacles supporting the skulls twitched twice. Then, the giant jellyfish slowly floated up, disappearing into the depths of the spirit world. This Dark Emperor card is still very useful. I was already considering throwing Mr. Azek's copper whistle. The descendants of death should still have some standing in the spirit world. Klein breathed a sigh of relief and descended, grabbing the black hardwood cane. Then he fell into the collapsed building ruin with a sense of anticipation. For him, even if the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military had found this place ahead of him and had taken away the most valuable items, he would still be satisfied as long as there were still some remaining. Even if there's nothing else, it'll be sufficient for me to explore an elven ruins and see what information they left behind. When Klein passed through an ethereal barrier that resembled a curtain, he felt the air around him suddenly become thick and heavy. A shimmering wave of light appeared around him, coming from the deep blue water that filled the area. At the bottom of the sea was an ancient, dark ruin. All the buildings had either collapsed or half-collapsed. A huge pillar, carved with strange patterns and symbols, extended out from the middle. It appeared to be heading straight up to the top, as if it had supported the place in the past, but now it was broken and was leaning on the top of a nearby building. Klein recognized this place as well as the pillar. It was the hiding place of sea god Calvatua, a hidden place where reality blended with the spirit world. At this very moment, an unwilling, pained, angry, and crazed scream echoed in the air. It didn't weaken in the slightest. That scream was precisely the same howl of hatred that Calvatua had let out before its death. "It's really dead." Holding the black cane, Klein landed on the greenish-gray stone road in front of the ancient ruins. On both sides of the road stood pillars that were neither thick nor tall, and on them were also strange patterns that were different from the symbols and magic labels from before. At the bottom of each stone pillar, there was a figure sitting beside it. Some of them wore ancient robes, while some wore brown jackets that were fashionable nowadays. As soon as they sensed someone approaching, they raised their swords, axes, and other weapons, stiffly but quickly. They turned to where Klein was, revealing their weathered, grayish-black faces and their shriveled bodies which were devoid of any flesh or blood. Their eyes, feverish and numb, were fixed on Klein, who was wearing a black crown and black armor. Calvatua's devotees, however. This also means that the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military haven't found this place yet. Klein sighed and injected his spirituality into the sun brooch. He muttered a word in Ancient Hermes, "Holy." He activated the sun brooch's holy oath, and through the corresponding word in Ancient Hermes, he temporarily added a holy attribute to the damage he dealt with his attacks. Puh! Klein flicked his wrist and threw his cane. He bent his body slightly and charged towards the first sea god guard, who came rushing over. While running at high speed, Klein suddenly turned left and dodged the enemy's axe. He then swung his arm backwards and used his cane to draw a clear grayish-white crack on the enemy's body. Pure golden flames silently rose from within the crack, wrapping around the sea god guard and burning it until it was on the verge of collapse. Bam! Klein exerted strength into his feet and stomped past the enemy. Behind him, the completely desiccated sea god guard finally collapsed, turning into ashes within the golden flame. Taboo, taboo, taboo. Klein bent his back, quickly moving forward, sometimes to the side, and sometimes diagonally as he passed by each of the sea god guard. At the same time, he brandished his cane, whipping, stabbing, cleaving, and slashing, leaving different marks on the guards that resembled desiccated corpses. Taboo, taboo, taboo. Klein passed through the road and arrived in front of the half-collapsed ruins. Behind his gently fluttering black cloak, the sea god guards bloomed into golden torches, lighting up the greenish-gray stone slate and the patterned pillar. Amidst the chaos, the guards fell down, one after the other, and no longer moved. Klein went up the steps and entered the building where the half-collapsed pillars were. First thing that entered his vision was an unimaginably huge blue sea serpent. The scales all over its body were slippery, and they were covered with patterns that were similar to the symbols inside the ruin. Its gaping jaws bit into a pillar, its curved milky-white fangs sinking in. Its body below its head height was slumped across the ground. Its cold body occupied about a third of the expansive hall, like a small blue hill. However, its surface was covered in wounds with mangled blood and flesh. Even its bones could be seen. Mysterious cyan light had already gathered over its body as it crept slowly towards one of its fangs that was longer than a human arm. This caused the slightly curved sharp bones to slowly straighten up. Its dying cry reverberated in the air, causing Klein's corporeal spirit body to show signs of instability. At this moment, an old man wearing a clergyman's cap was lying beside Calvatua's body. His hair was gray, and his body was like a gray rock. He stuck his face tightly to the serpent's body, making incomprehensible sounds from his throat. His actions were an unknown. Around the gigantic serpent's corpse were desiccated corpses. They were similar to the sea god guards outside, but they were even more bizarre. Their stomachs bulged to the point of rupturing. In addition, their mouths were stained with dark red blood and had strips of bluish meat hanging from them. The blue dots of light also leaked out from their bodies, rushing towards the white fang that was gradually straightening up. Before Klein could figure out what such a scene signified, the old man in the clergyman's cap, who was lying on top of Calvatua, stood up in a staggered manner and turned around. His eyes were flashing with a blue light. His mouth was covered in blood-red meat, which he was using all his strength to bite into. In the place where his face had been stuck to, the snake's body was mangled. It was missing a lot of flesh and blood, and even its bones were almost visible. He was eating up the corpse of sea god Calvatua. This, Klein frowned, roughly understanding what was happening. After Calvatua's death, the priest and guards in the hall lost control and began to frantically devour its flesh and blood. At this point in time, the Beyonder characteristics had yet to appear completely. Calvatua's body still contained a large part of it, and many guards had problems with a potion overdose or conflicting pathway characteristics. They broke down on the spot and died completely. However, there were always people who were lucky enough to survive the sudden death, or there were those who lost control of themselves and became disgusting monsters, or those who directly skipped a few sequences and became a powerhouse, or those who became lunatics with distorted demonic powers due to the mixture of pathway characteristics. Regardless of which one it was extremely dangerous. Klein looked down from the surviving priest's face to see his belly bulging like a pregnant woman. A strong burgeoning and contraction appeared there, resembling a huge heart.